For most of us, the glory days of the railways tend to mean one thing: the distant age of steam. The record-breaking express trains, the silver service, the glamour, the romance. We can get misty-eyed when we think of steam, but those nostalgic puffs of smoke have clouded out some less romantic realities.
Very, very grimy. Looked as if they were going to break down any second, and sometimes did.
You used to sit on the seats and you'd sink into the seats. As you get older, you think, well, maybe that wasn't quite so comfortable.
If you put your head out of the window, you would get a piece of grit in your eye, which would come out of the top of the chimney of the locomotive and would come whizzing down the side of the train.
Keep your eye still. There it is.
Yet there was another golden age, one less well known. When the nationalised British Railways replaced steam with modern engines, a new railway was born. It perked things up for passengers.
It not only provided more comfortable, faster travel, but it also said something about the railways. It said, this is a modern way to travel.
It made groundbreaking technological advances.
We were doing things on a daily basis that had never been done before anywhere in the world.
And British Rail became a world leader.
Outside of Japan, it was the most frequent and reliable high-speed line in the Western world.
Shortly after nationalisation, a film unit had been established to capture the optimism of the nation's railway. With the departure of steam, its filmmakers came into their own, promoting the new age of the train.
They made films which were seen by a wide public and enjoyed by a wide public and were of a high quality and were respected and well regarded in the film world.
These films document how British Rail left Victorian engineering behind to give us our first generation of high-speed trains. They even show us how to drive one.
I'm experiencing wheel slip. I'm correcting it. I'm back to normal running. Everything's okay.
The modern railway had a lot to be optimistic about. The glory days of steam were over, and the golden age of British Rail had just begun. The mid-60s marked a turning point for Britain's nationalised railway. After years of preparation and planning, British Rail was launching a new service between London and Manchester. For the first time, a clean, fast train with all the mod cons would depart at the same times every hour. They branded this new fast service Intercity.
It was Birmingham for breakfast, Liverpool by 10, a quick rundown from Manchester, and now we're off again. There's a festival in Edinburgh, a conference in Crewe, a matinee at Stratford.
Intercity promised high-speed trains at regular intervals. The first service between London and Manchester slashed an entire hour off journey times.
There's an important match this afternoon, 100 miles from here. So take a seat on the midday train and be in time for the start of the game.
Good morning.
The hub for all these innovations was the modern, sleek new Euston station, which was completed in 1968.
When I first visited the new Euston, I was so pleased to see a brilliant train describer split up very clearly with lit panels, arrivals, departures. You knew exactly where to go. And then beyond the board were the platforms, numbered logically. No problem with dark corridors. You could go exactly to the train you wanted to get.
I wonder if there's a little man in there turning it over.
It's a big space, lovely clean space, bags of room to take pictures of people. Actually, all the way around the perimeter is a walkway looking down on Euston, and there's some fantastic, particularly when there's a big crowd. It's very impressive.
The intercity service would be key to British Rail's future success. The newly electrified West Coast Main Line would symbolise how railways of the future would operate.
Out of the melting pot came a brand new electric railway, using a 25,000-volt supply straight from the national grid. Where traffic was heavy, the system promised great economies, and it had great possibilities for technical development.
The London Midland electrification scheme was almost a totemic project for British Rail, and was seen by management as their means of dragging the railway into the 20th or 21st century even. It did result in a massive increase in passenger numbers. Passengers in Preston, Crewe, Stafford doubled in an 8-month period.
Still a little further than the pioneering stage in the early 50s, the decision to install it was as far-sighted as some of the great decisions of 100 years before.
And it took it until 1974 for full plans to be realised and link up Glasgow to the rest of the West Coast Main Line, resulting in one of the best high-speed railways in the Western world.
The new electrified line carried state-of-the-art trains, propelling passengers at unprecedented speed and with many of the trappings of a first-class service, but at an accessible price.
It did 100 miles an hour. I remember flashing past the M1 at Watford Gap with all the other traffic slowly moving along. Cars really couldn't do much more than 70 miles an hour in those days. With this bright blue electric locomotive hauling us in front and getting to Manchester in not much more than 2 hours. It's not a lot less than that today, actually.
The new, fast, streamlined intercity services were a far cry from the worn-out system Britain had inherited after the Second World War.
And the railways, what have we got there? Operated for more than 100 years without a break. Feeding a war machine for 6 weary years without adequate renewals and repairs that left them as tired as the rest of us. A wonderful but complicated heritage that could do with a bit of sorting out.
The railways were in a desperate state. They had been heavily used in the war and required a large amount of investment. It was felt that only the state would be able to carry that out.
In 1947, by Act of Parliament, Britain set up the British Transport Commission. Its task? To make all transport work as one.
The Transport Act was revolutionary. The existing railway companies would be nationalised. This new venture was called British Railways. Like many nationalised industries, it established a film unit, British Transport Films.
And one of the thoughts they had was that if they've got all this work to do, how are we going to communicate it? One of the people that was a shining light in all that was Edgar Anstey. He worked with John Grierson in the 20s and the 30s, so he was a very, very experienced director-producer. Nothing left BTF without his approval.
Broadly speaking, they were focused on 3 main patterns of activity. The first was to promote the use of the transport network initially and latterly just British Rail to its customers, the general public, and hence why so many travelogues were made about various locations around the UK.
My doctor once said to me, "There's nothing wrong with you that a blow on the coast won't cure." And I was never quite certain whether he meant the great open spaces of Blackpool Sands where a man can be close to nature, or the challenge to adventure of the great trackless wastes of Southport.
Secondly, the use of film for internal communication purposes, in other words, to update staff on new technology, changes in working practices, training issues, etc.
You need a good sense of speed and timing to work this efficiently. Modernisation in railways means looking at all the old jobs and seeing where modern engineering and science can be brought in to give them a new look.
And thirdly, to communicate both to the general public and to the staff a general sense of the momentum of investment in and development of British Railways, particularly on the technological side.
British Transport Film's initial task was to explain to the public how a disparate and disconnected railway could be integrated into a unified transport network. The film was simply called Transport. It explained that prior to the war, Britain's railways were operated by 4 major companies: the Southern, London and North Eastern, Great Western and London Midland and Scottish Railways.
And big and powerful, the railways had moved on into other fields. Docks, steamships, hotels.
British Rail inherited an awful lot. There were hotels, there were ships that ran across to Ireland and across to France. They inherited several 100,000 horses, for example, so it was a huge enterprise.
Schemes are made for people, not people for schemes. We like things that way round, and that way takes time.
The film has a very sober series of points to put forward to the public, and it's made in a classical, almost a wartime documentary film style. But it also got a sort of softer edge to it as well, particularly in the use of various voiceovers, which were often quite quirky.
You wouldn't think that little boards like this could upset all that, would you? And thereby hangs another part of the tale.
And that sort of slight edge of eccentricity is often to be found later in British transport films.
The films were made to a very high technical standard. Some even achieved a cinema release, although many more were likely to be seen at the village hall rather than the picture house.
Stemming right back to the 1930s, British documentary always made great use of what we call the non-theatrical market. This was where women's institutes, engineering clubs, user groups had their own screenings as part of regular meetings.
And we had a fleet of vans with projectors and projectionists. Any organisation could write to us. I mean, if they wanted a film show, if they didn't have their own projector, we would supply one.
When I was at school, they had access to the British Transport Library, I suppose. I mean, there was everything from the railways, changing points, there was one on the motorway on the M1 and stuff like that, so it was quite varied for those films.
Produced to promote the railway, it's not surprising these films tended to have a rose-tinted view of train travel. What they show us now is that in the 1950s, British Railways were still somewhat stuck in the past. As the rest of Europe electrified their main lines, we were still investing in steam locomotion.
Well, basically, the 1950s railway was very similar to the 1890s railway. The engines had got bigger, the trains had got bigger, they went a bit faster, but it was basically still operated in exactly the same manner.
Today, steam billows with nostalgic value, but for commuters then, the experience was very different.
There seemed to be a layer of dust on everything, on the seats and on the windows that you could barely see out of. These very noisy and very dirty steam engines that seemed to be attached to the front of them. I think I was sort of vaguely repelled by them.
You used to sit on the seats and you'd sink into the seats. They were very bouncy seats, which as children, that was great for us. But as you get older, you think, well, maybe that wasn't quite so comfortable. You know, you could hang out the window, which you're not allowed to do anymore.
If you put your head out of the window, the chances were that you would get a piece of grit in your eye, which had come out of the top of the chimney of the locomotive and had come whizzing down the side of the train. And those bits of grit were very difficult to get out.
Some stations even had nurses on hand to help.
4 minutes now.
You've been out on the platforms looking at trains, have you? All right. And just keep your eye still. There it is. All right now?
Right, thanks, sister.
But it wasn't just the dirt and the noise that caused irritation to passengers.
It was unwise to sit in the carriage next to the engine, because if you were going on a long trip, the locomotive didn't want to stop at a water tower to get water, so a device had been invented known as a water trough. Now, if the driver had instructed the fireman to drop the scoop underneath the tender, as the train went along, the water rushed into the scoop, up into a dome on the tender, but as soon as the tender was full, all the water came spurting out and in through the open windows of the carriages if anybody had been foolish enough to leave them open.
In 1955, engineers were commissioned to design a new generation of locomotives, with engines powered by diesel and electric. The age of steam was coming to an end. One of the first of the new diesel trains would be for first-class passengers only. A luxury service designed to bring glamour back to the tracks. It was called the Blue Pullman.
The Blue Pullmans were very striking because they were a totally different shape from anything that had gone before. It was so modern, with newly designed cutlery, glass, porcelain. It was very luxurious. The driver was told to wear a white coat and a white hat, rather like a Wall's ice cream man.
The Blue Pullman was aimed at business travellers. Revenue from premium ticket prices would go to fund improvements elsewhere in the rail system.
As far as the Blue Pullman's concerned, I was never rich enough to travel on it. I used to overtake my bus as I was coming home from school at most nights, so I tend to see it quite a lot, actually, the Blue Pullman. I got the impression, looking through the windows, that everybody was dining on tablecloths, all looking very comfortable. It looked extremely swished.
People let out a whoop in the train when it was discovered that we were doing between 85 and 90 miles an hour.
It was the kind of thing you'd expected, certainly at the time, of an airline. And that was the idea of it, was to provide an alternative to the growing domestic air market and also to people who wanted to drive.
For most people, everyday rail travel was a world apart from the Blue Pullman experience. In 1961, a film was produced which more accurately depicted the state of the network. Called Terminus, it shows a day in the life of London's busiest station, Waterloo.
It was directed by John Schlesinger, and he would go on to become a well-known feature filmmaker associated with the British New Wave. And that sort of comes across in the film. Terminus was a high watermark for British transport films. It won a lot of awards from people who had never really particularly admired British transport films before, because British transport films, although very well regarded, they were certainly never particularly fashionable. And Terminus feels like a much more contemporary statement about the 1960s.
Don't forget Paula's yard time.
Terminus was unique, not only because it captured the day-to-day running of a big London station, but also the changing face of British society.
There are various little shots of a train of immigrants arriving. This was when the first wave of immigration started coming in the late 50s and showing all these people coming in all dressed up smart to look smart for this new country, and oh dear, they probably got disillusioned fairly quickly.
Jamaica, Jamaica mine, Jamaica.
For many, rail travel was not a pleasant experience. With dilapidated stations and ageing trains, passenger numbers were down. Car ownership was also on the increase. The railways were under serious threat. Drastic change was needed, and fast. The man brought in to do the job was former ICI director, Dr. Richard Beeching. In Reshaping British Railways, Beeching addressed the nation with his landmark report into the industry.
When Dr. Beeching was going to present his report, we did a film version of it. And I was with him and the rest of the crew in the Railways Board boardroom.
But what about all this modernisation? Can't we have the branch lines as well? Can't you attract enough traffic to them to make them pay? But unfortunately, we can't, because the traffic is not there, and so many people have motor cars.
The good doctor, Dr. Beeching, had said to the railwaymen, he said, find out what you do best and concentrate on that, which effectively meant commuter traffic, long-distance express passenger services, and heavy full-load freight trains that don't try and do everything, which the railway had been trying to do before.
Fundamental to Beeching's plan was the introduction of fast, regular routes between the major cities. He described these services as intercity, and the name stuck.
So, on the passenger side, the proposal is to go for development and improvement in the intercity services. It is believed that they will come to be recognised as easily the best form of transport to be used between our great centres of population and business.
So then the director said, that's it, we're done, we're finished. And he says, oh well, back to hostilities, and then walked off. I think he knew what was going to happen.
The result was a reduction in the railway network by about a third, the closure of over 2,000 stations, and the loss of tens of thousands of jobs. All this brought instant notoriety to Beeching. Seen as the axeman of the rail system, he became a target for satirists.
Oh, Mr. Porter, what shall I do? They've taken away your station, though your uniform is new. I'll have to get to London the best way I can see. Whoa, Mr. Porter, what a tired chap. I'll be...
But nothing could stop the ongoing modernisation of the railway network. Despite even Beeching's opposition, the electrification of the West Coast Main Line continued.
What does this electrification scheme really mean to Britain? Obviously, it's going to be a showpiece. Not only, I hope, of the railways, but also a showpiece of what we mean when we talk about the modernisation of Britain. This is modernisation.
A modern railway required modern stations, and the jewel in the crown of the modernisation programme would be Euston.
The average visitor turning up at Euston Station would have been presented with a pretty amazing sight, passing through the Doric Arch. You'd proceed into the Great Hall, which was something akin to having the Parthenon as the booking hall for your railway station. Problem being, it wasn't fit for purpose to facilitate a modern high-speed rail service.
It was difficult to know where a train was coming into or where it was leaving from, because it was a series of passageways that were poorly lit, and the signage could have been better.
The Doric Arch at Euston had a fairly dramatic fall from grace, was demolished, and much of the stonework actually ended up in a canal in East London.
The poor state of Euston Station wasn't the railway's only problem. The network was made up of several regions, each with its own colour schemes and branding. It was confusing for passengers and caused difficulties when it came to marketing British Railways.
Various experimental liveries, some of them bizarre, and some which were nicknamed Plum and Spilt Milk.
You typically have a 9 or 10 coach train. It would be a variety of colours, some red and cream, some maybe brown and cream, because at one stage the railways were allowed to go back to their pre-nationalisation colours, and the Western region had done that with some alacrity.
To remain competitive, British Railways needed to ditch its make-do and mend image and present a modern, easy-to-understand identity. It hired the Design Research Unit, famed for their work on the Festival of Britain, to coordinate a new corporate look.
This was really British Rail's attempt to present a unified face to the travelling public, and something that would allow itself to be marketed much in the same way as you would soap flakes or fizzy drinks. So this was one of the largest, if not the largest, corporate branding exercises that had been seen in Britain.
They produced a manual which covered everything, from the style of a letterhead to the uniforms of the staff.
The unit uniform did create a bit of a stir and was widely slated in the press as being too German.
They also designed its brand logo, the double arrow.
British Rail was in the forefront of modern design. Its little logo that goes like this, and very difficult to reproduce from your head, actually. It's so clever. That was a remarkably successful way of saying, this is the railway, come onto it.
Alongside the work of the Design Research Unit, new signage was commissioned from Margaret Calvert, known for Britain's now iconic road signs.
In a sense, they were starting from scratch, and they really believed in let this be the best for Britain and in modernism.
Margaret's design for the road system produced the transport alphabet. The rail system would require a different approach.
I felt that transport was designed specifically to be read at speed, whereas I felt you could be using a more compact typeface in a pedestrian situation.
She came up with a more pared-down font.
We needed it to look low-key so that it stood out from the commercial signs, which were far more flamboyant. And so we wanted that difference because we felt people would then believe in it. So it's quite ordinary. And I quite like the word ordinary because people think nobody designed it because it's ordinary.
In 1965, British Railways unveiled its new identity. Its signs, its uniform and its logo were all on show. It also shortened its name from British Railways to British Rail. 3 years later, in 1968, the new Euston Station was opened.
To some extent, Euston and Birmingham Euston were an answer to airline terminals. You know, I think that's the reason why Euston had virtually no seating for any passengers, because they were seen as a kind of throughput, just to go through in the same way that you go through an airline terminal.
Euston was only one of many stations that were completely revamped. Some were designed to encourage the motorist back onto the railway.
At Pudsey, on the Euston region, they've evolved the idea of a car park with a station attached. It's situated at the converging point of several main roads and a ring road, and is in fact a station for motorists.
Others aimed to make intercity travel more pleasurable and become places to dine and have a drink.
Not many people think of stations as places to relax in. Now some in Britain begin to qualify as meeting and resting places like those of a few continental cities. The tourist restaurant at Birmingham New Street, from its carpeted floor to its ceiling alcoves over each table, is modern in design and layout. The result is an imaginative change from a forbidding tradition. The tables have been arranged alongside a series of passageways, from which the waitresses serve and along which they may be summoned by a coloured light system. A change from cricked necks and tortured faces.
There was a burgeoning social movement of increased freedom, social mobility. Society was opening up, and I suppose British Rail really just tuned into that, and they provided the necessary social mobility in terms of a high-speed electrified railway for kids, essentially, to travel between Manchester, Liverpool, London, and to actually get involved in that exploding culture that was happening at the time.
The new British Rail would be clean, fast and easy to use, the smoke and soot of steam soon becoming a quaint novelty. In 1968, Evening Star, the last steam locomotive built by British Railways, made its final journey. 2 years later, British Transport Films, with a little help from rail enthusiast and poet John Betjeman, were on hand to wave steam off.
Why are we all so excited by steam? A boy's young passion, an old man's dream. Steam, steam, beautiful steam. We won't be so sorry to part with the lorry as now when we're parting with steam. Quick, out with your vest pocket Kodak, on with your long focus lens.
Despite the nostalgia, many passengers were glad to see the back of steam.
There had to be a last steam engine, and Evening Star was the last steam engine. Now we could all move on and look forward to what was coming in the future. It was very much moving from the old system to modernity, and modernity in those days was everything. A lot less nostalgia.
The end of steam was dramatically captured in British Transport Films' Plum Loco, which shows locomotives being cut up, melted down and remade into wires. Luckily, Evening Star escaped this fate and now resides in the National Railway Museum at York. British Rail had moved on. Although it continued to lose money, its passenger numbers were increasing. And with even faster trains on its network, the future looked bright.
From the late 60s through into the 70s, British Rail can certainly claim to have created some of the best railways in Europe. When the West Coast Main Line was fully electrified to Glasgow, outside of Japan, it was the most frequent and reliable high-speed line in the Western world.
In reality, if the railways were going to compete with road and air travel, not only did they need to be much faster, they also needed to be at the forefront of technology. For British Rail, the 1970s would be a decade characterised by the development of two high-tech trains. One would make British Rail more popular than ever. The other would promise to revolutionise the entire future of rail travel.
We started to hear about a train that would tilt, and this would enable it to go on the West Coast Main Line at far higher speeds.
As British Rail was competing against cars and planes, it looked to those industries for inspiration and new ideas, much to the surprise of dyed-in-the-wool railwaymen. The APT, or Advanced Passenger Train, would be built by engineers recruited from aviation and the motor industry.
Oh, I am an aeronautical engineer. Well, I worked on blue steel, which was the deterrent for the Vulcan, like a cruise missile. I was highly qualified because I knew nothing at all about the subject.
British transport films captured in detail the development of the APT, a train that could run at 155 miles an hour on existing track.
A train that could take curves up to 50% faster than present-day trains, a requirement that called for new studies of wheel-on-rail behaviour. A train that would always give passengers a comfortable ride, especially when running through curves at high speed. All design requirements for an advanced passenger train.
So could one go faster on existing track? And the answer was, if you tilted the coach, then you could get the passenger to feel as if he was more or less on straight track, just like a motorcyclist banking round a curve, really.
APT pulled British Rail's rail technology out of the 1960s and pushed it into the 1980s in one fell swoop.
Mathematics,
In order to build the APT, British Rail set up a new experimental facility in Derby.
Soon, a new advanced projects laboratory was taking shape at Derby. Here, there would be some of the most powerful test rigs and accurate measuring instruments available to any railway in the world.
Derby, famed for its technical advances, became the centre of rail research.
Derby Tech was a series of buildings with just oscilloscopes and computers, and they were all doing something new.
We were doing things on a daily basis that had never been done before anywhere in the world. Some of the work, just in my own particular field, and incredibly boring to a non-technical person, was discovering how dirt works in hydraulic oil. I mean, people think, is that really important? Actually, yes, it is.
Although the advanced passenger train captured the nation's imagination, its development was taking longer than expected. Having initially been overlooked, BR Engineering now brought their own high-speed offer to the table, called the HST, or high-speed train.
The HST was conceived as a low-risk alternative to APT, employing conventional technology, but with a maximum speed of 125 miles an hour.
The HST was developed by the Chief Mechanical and Electrical Engineers Department. They called themselves the Real Railway, whereas we in the Advanced Projects Division were seen as those upstarts from the motor industry and the aviation industry. To say there was not a lot of love lost between us was a very true statement. If they wanted some information from us, we were pretty loath to give it, and vice versa.
1972 saw the launch of the experimental APT and the prototype HST trains. This represented a high watermark for British Rail. The HST quickly broke the record for the fastest diesel train in the world.
In the earlier days, the train had actually run at 143 miles an hour.
The high-speed train and advanced passenger train were part of an age of great British engineering. Britain was at the cutting edge, and it was building the future. The poster boy of this dynamism was a supersonic jet, Concorde.
The advanced passenger train for many people was the Concorde of the railways. If you were into motor cars, you aspired to a Jaguar E-Type. If you were into aircraft, you aspired to Concorde. If you were into railways, it was the advanced passenger train.
On one occasion, one of the production Concordes was doing its flight trials from RAF Fairford, which wasn't very far away. And early one morning, one of the prototypes took off, turned round and flew over the top of us. I wish I'd taken a photograph of that because it was so symptomatic of what British technology was doing at the time.
Not everyone was happy with the two prototype trains. Soon after they were launched, both projects hit the buffers.
Built like an aeroplane and able to cruise at over 150 miles an hour, the supertrain was shown off for the first time some 5 months ago. Since then, it hasn't moved from the sidings at Derby. ASLEF men have refused to drive it because, their union says, British Rail won't agree to higher pay for drivers.
We had put the driver's seat in the middle of the cab. ASLEF objected to this because they were insisting on 2 drivers in every train. So they blacked the train.
The HST also had a single driver seat, and it too was boycotted. It was more than just seats that were causing problems. During the mid-70s, spiralling inflation led to a period of nationwide industrial unrest that affected many industries. The railways were no exception, and services suffered.
The drivers' union was trying to get better terms for its men, and they saw the high-speed train and advanced passenger trains as suitable weapons to use in their argument. So, no, we're not going to take them in passenger service.
British Rail's reputation was badly damaged. Public confidence in the railways was reaching an all-time low.
This is bad, though, isn't it? Just bad. I'll do their job any day.
How long are you going to wait for your train?
Oh, as soon as we can get one.
It wasn't just strikes that were denting British Rail's image. Modernisation of the system wasn't as widespread as the management had once hoped.
Depending on where you lived in Britain, dictated how you viewed the nation's railways. If you were in the big cities, you tended to be able to take advantage of a new high-speed railway. However, if you're living in one of the further flung parts of the country where investment hadn't really caught up, you could be forgiven for thinking the railways were still selling you short.
People didn't know what was wanted from the railway or what they wanted from the railway. Successive governments didn't seem to know what they wanted. BR did not have a good reputation. The expression lame duck was frequently used for that and a lot of other nationalised industries.
In 1976, British Rail appointed a new chairman, Peter Parker. He was considered popular with railwaymen and the unions. He also had a head for public relations.
You know, industrial democracy's got a lot to do with the standards in the lavatory as well as appearances in the boardroom. Worth every penny!
Parker needed to improve BR's tarnished image. He turned to another Peter, advertising guru Peter Marsh, for ideas for some BR PR. Marsh gave Parker a British Rail-style welcome.
They were put into a waiting room, told to wait. The room was dirty, ashtrays hadn't been emptied. And in the end, Peter Marsh came in and told them he was very sorry about this and the state of the waiting room. But I just wanted to remind you of the conditions that many of your passengers have to travel in every day.
The waiting rooms were one thing, but on the long list of passenger complaints, the most infamous was British Rail catering.
Can you get onto them and say that those must go in, even if it's at the expense of 3, 4 and 5?
Parker asked restaurateur Prue Leith to join the BR board to sort it out.
Talked about curly sandwiches. British Rail sandwiches were never curly because they were not left out in the open. They were soggy. They were wrapped up in plastic wrap. Plastic wrap was still quite new. The first thing I really wanted to do, because I'm basically a cook, is I wanted to make a decent sandwich. And I remember everybody saying, but we sell more sandwiches than anybody else in the country. And I said, well, I'm not surprised. That's all you sell. You only sell one sandwich. It's Mother's Pride bread, Kraft cheese slices, and Anchor butter. And they said, well, those are the most popular bread, the most popular cheese, and the most popular butter. Of course, it's the best. And I said, look, let's try and make other sandwiches and see if the public like them.
It took time, but with better quality ingredients and imaginative fillings, Prue Leith gave British Rail sandwiches that would no longer be synonymous with poor service.
But I always resented the sandwich story because people always, the press particularly, always talked of me as the woman who changed British Rail sandwiches. And I thought, damn it all, I'm on the board of this company. It's an enormous company. I do more than fix the sandwiches. But that was just hubris. I should be glad that they remembered the sandwiches.
By 1975, industrial relations at BR were on a better footing. Work had continued on the development of the 2 new trains. Whilst the advanced passenger train was still undergoing rigorous testing, it was full steam ahead for the high-speed train. Working with the unions, the HST power car had been redesigned by Kenneth Grange to accommodate 2 drivers. It was rebranded the Intercity 125, and the train became an advertiser's dream.
It had a really strong brand image. So the nose cone, which I think is one of the great industrial icons, if you like, of the 1970s, the Intercity 125 nose cone.
British Transport Films produced a film that followed the journey of the Intercity 125 from its prototype to passenger service. With a specially composed musical score, it was called Overture 125.
The filmmaking is really underscoring and expressing the type of corporate self-image that British Rail was maybe wanting to project. It isn't this huge lumbering empire necessarily. It's cutting edge, it's efficient, it's fast, but it's also really pleasant. It's really good at what it does.
On the inaugural passenger journey from Paddington to Bristol, it arrived 3 minutes early and was an instant hit.
And they started to be introduced between Edinburgh and King's Cross, Paddington and Bristol and the West Country. And the people, the passengers, took to them immediately.
British Rail's new express is wooing passengers with high-speed technology outside and in. Automatic doors became immediately popular today.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
There's air conditioning, double glazing, and even second class gets wall-to-wall carpets. And in the bar they serve draft beer, the only train in Britain that does. Rail officials are hoping this train will win the passengers.
My first trip on a 125 was when we went from King's Cross to York, and being the journalists that we were, we'd all piled into the buffet car because in those days they served Whitbread tankard in draft. So we'd all got pints of Whitbread tankard on the bar, and they put the brakes on to do an emergency stop at 125 miles an hour to a stop, and it did, and not a drop of beer was spilled.
Well, the first time I got onto the Intercity 125, the HST, was at Peterborough. Being only about 7, this big beast, completely different to anything else that had been before, arrived in to the station, and obviously with the classic nose on the front, it was, ooh, this is new.
It was like going first class for us, because you'd gone with the banging doors and the bouncy seats, and you had proper seats.
It felt a lot more comfortable, and I do remember sitting there because all of you had an armrest, which was unusual, and you could sit in this big comfy chair with a table, and it was luxurious, cool, absolutely wonderful.
And I suppose in this, the brand new era of high-speed rail travel, it just had to come. The high-speed loop.
The family story that we never let my cousin forget is because he was younger than us, and he'd come back running down the train shouting out to my mum, "Auntie Marion, I've done a poo at 125 miles an hour." And it was like, yeah, you didn't really want to shout that out.
BR had given Britain record-breaking high-speed trains at a price that most could afford. Passenger numbers rose dramatically. On top of this, a study in 1981 by Leeds University found that not only was it the cheapest, but after Sweden, British Rail was the second most efficient railway in Europe. BR was getting it right, it seemed. The 1980s really did look like being the age of the train. And the advanced passenger train was yet to come.
What I was aware of at the time, perhaps there was an impatience with the slow development of the APT. And Intercity 125, or the high-speed train, was really only ever meant as a stopgap.
Having undergone several more years in development, 1981 saw the APT make its first trip. And with the success of the Intercity 125, British Rail's public image had never been better.
The central station in Glasgow this morning before 7. 250 passengers, mainly railway enthusiasts and journalists, board a shortened experimental prototype APT, British Rail's cut-price answer to France's new high-speed train.
Of course, 6:30 in December, it was pitch black. Because they were using the tilt system all the way out of the station, and for the next 20 or 30 miles to the south, it was as if somebody had straightened the track out. You couldn't tell when you were going around a curve at all. And I was so impressed. The guys had done a really good job, and it was just like travelling in a straight line.
And by daylight it's well past Carlisle and Penrith, over Shap's Summit and down the Loon Valley. The fast and smooth acceleration, the revolutionary suspension, the lightweight construction, aerodynamic shape give little sensation of speed.
However, we got a bit further south when the sun started to come up, and you could see the horizon going up and down as the train was tilting, going into corners. And at that point, a lot of the people started to get, quote, tilt sick, unquote. It was significant that the greater majority of the passengers who were suffering from tilt sickness were the media representatives who the previous night had been in a bar in the hotel being entertained by British Rail. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. But the train did very, very well. And that first southbound run down to Euston was fault-free.
Because it runs on conventional track, it hasn't needed the £850 million spent by the French on their high-speed train track. Even so, the APT has taken 13 years to get from the drawing board to Euston Station, largely because only £37 million has been spent on it.
The train earned the reputation for tilt-induced nausea, but that was the least of British Rail's worries. 2 days after its initial journey, the train broke down.
The first sitting for breakfast should have been served at 125 miles an hour, with the train's tilting system smoothing out the curves in the track south of Motherwell. In the event, not a drop of tea or fruit juice was spilt, because for 40 minutes the train didn't move.
And 2 days after that, it failed to reach its destination once more.
And we slid out of Glasgow on time at 7 o'clock. But after only 8 minutes, the lights flickered and dimmed, and APT coasted to a shameful halt.
It was put into service too quickly. If it had been allowed to be developed by the engineers over a reasonable timescale, it would have been more reliable.
It wasn't just the advanced passenger train that was in trouble. In 1982, British Transport Films was disbanded. There was no longer an appetite for this type of corporate film.
These films, they're selling modernity, and they're telling a big story about investment and technology change and a progressive move forward. And yet the irony is that, you know, they themselves become a kind of obsolete part of the railway system, which then gets discarded in the early 1980s.
One of its final films, Round Trip to Glasgow, was designed to hit back at the advanced passenger train's bad press.
Smooth, it's quiet, and an altogether delightful experience. Everything that the developers and designers have told me the train should do, it does appear to do, and does it exceptionally well. I'll be in Euston a little over 4 hours after leaving Glasgow Central. And that's got to make this a train very much worth taking.
Whilst Peter Purvis did his best to sell the new train, the bad press meant passengers were less enthusiastic. Only 3 trains were manufactured, and in 1984 the entire project was scrapped.
It was rather sad to see the pictures in the papers of the trains being scrapped. And there certainly was a feeling that, why did I waste my time doing all that? Having said that, in later years, other trains throughout the world, to this day, are still using APTP tilt systems. So much of the equipment was totally new. And my view would be that there were too many new ideas in one train.
The advanced passenger train never had a chance because it never got the support it really deserved particularly from the civil servants and the politicians. Maybe because none of them had any real long-term belief in the future of the railways.
Unlike the Intercity 125, the advanced passenger train failed to grab the public imagination. By the 1990s, the political climate had also changed.
There was a public conception of nationalised industries and other public bodies. These were inefficient organisations. That's how the public seemed to see them. Possibly that's because politicians wanted the public to see them in that way.
In 1994, after 47 years of public ownership, British Rail was privatised. In many ways, the clock was being turned back. The network would once again be filled by a variety of individual rail companies, each with their own distinct branding and liveries. But this time, the new companies would inherit an efficient modern railway.
BR was by far the most efficient railway in Europe. Its services weren't necessarily the best, but it cost the British taxpayer far, far less than the equivalents in other European countries. And BR has had no recognition of that.
I think in the last 10 years of British Railways, they'd got everything right. And it was ripe for privatisation. And I think they should be given the credit for that.
What did British Rail do? I think British Rail probably its biggest success was in preventing any more of the railway network being closed than many people wanted to achieve.
Its greatest legacy can still be seen every day, travelling at speeds of 125 miles per hour.
If someone had told me in 1975 that this train that you're working on will still be in frontline service in 40 years' time, I'd have said, pull the other one. But it is.